So, without further ado, now why won't there we go, that's better. Right. So, the Walters, they were silk manufacturers in Spitalfields. The earliest one we find is Benjamin Walters from 1697, and this is Joseph Walters, his son, and this is a painting that Thomas Gainsborough did, and he, as it says there, he lived until 1782. He became a master of the Worshipful Company of Weavers, and he married Mary Darwent, and he is listed as a mercer with the Darwent family in 1753. But his son, Joseph II, he was apprenticed to a different Huguenot weaver, John Dubois. And for some reason, he didn't work with his father. But Joseph II and his brother George, they joined with their father once they'd done their apprentices, and they were producing silk fabrics for dresses and also silks for furnishing, furniture silks as they called it. And they lived and worked at 25 Wilkes Street off Fournier Street, which is near to Christchurch, Spitalfields. And here we can see it. There is Wilkes Street just there. There's All Saints, Christchurch, Spitalfield is just there. So that's where they were working at that time. This is taken from Richard Horwood's plan, which he surveyed between 1792 and 99, saying the cities of London and Westminster, the borough of Southwark, and parts adjoining shoeing every house. So that's where they were in Wilkes Street, number 25. And he very kindly gives us the house numbers. Now, three of Joseph's sons followed in the family silk weaving tradition. There was Joseph III, Stephen, and Daniel. And they did pretty well. And so Wilkes Street premises weren't big enough anymore. So they moved to just inside the walls of the City of London, off of Cheapside, to Bow Lane. And Bow Lane is just there. That's Bow Lane going up there. And the next picture shows it a bit more detail. So that's Bow Lane, and that's Bow Churchyard there. And this is Cheapside here. This was the first in quite a lot of moves. There's an engraving of Bow Church. So Bow Lane would have been going down just the other side there. They did very, very well. And by 1825, they've established J&S Walters of 15 Wilson Street in Finsbury. Now, Finsbury is Finsbury Square there. This is virtually Shoreditch, really. So here's Wilson Street going up here. And this is sort of, if you imagine where Liverpool Street Station is, this is sort of the area north of Liverpool Street Station. So that's what they were doing. So John and Stephen, Joseph rather, and Stephen were producing dress silks at number 15 Wilson Street, whereas their brother Daniel, he was specialising in weaving silks and velvets for furnishings at number 14. Now, when I say they're producing silks there, they were using people working in their own cottages, in their own houses, in and around the East End of London. They didn't actually manufacture there. So here's an image that I found on the Tower Hamlets Local History Collection. It gives you an idea of what the conditions were like. I use this when I do my talk about the history of textiles in East Anglia, and it shows you it's not exactly a palace, is it? You know, they're living and working in exactly the same room. They've got the food on the table here, and there's a loom there set up the other side of the room where the husband is weaving, and he's weaving a very simple cloth there. It's probably a taffeta of some sort because there's no jacquard up the top here. So there we go. But Stephen and Daniel expanded the business a bit further. And this is where the Courtaulds come into it. This is Samuel Courtaulds' original mill in Panfield Lane in Braintree, and he opened his business there in 1816. He did quite well, but he needed a bigger premises, more modern premises. The machinery in this building was actually operated by hand. So they were winding silk, they were throwing silk, which is the process where they make the silk thread thick enough to use for weaving. So you double it, you treble it, you quadruple it to create a thread that you can use for weaving the fabric. So they wanted bigger premises. So they built this building here. Now, this is the opposite side of the road to what we now call Warner's Mill. This is Pound End Mill. And this was built by Samuel Courtauld and his brother-in-law Peter Taylor in 1818. And when I was doing my researches into this, I found in the archive, in the Tech Warner archive, an account written by Hester Berry, who was the first ever archivist in Warner's when it was still a textile company. And she'd got access to some of the Courtauld papers. And in it, she's found this letter that Samuel Courtauld wrote to his sister Sophia in January 1818. And he says this: first of all, we know that they bought the land from a man called Grant the Miser for £120. And in his letter to his sister, he says, this snug little mill will be 60 foot long, 23.5 foot wide, and 3 stories, weatherboarding, beaded edge, painted stone colour with black sashes and a slate roof. And apparently his brother-in-law was very sceptical that they would get this mill open by May. And because he writes, Samuel again writes in April, the building is as good as finished. My mechanists are already busy within the walls, and I shall redeem my engagement to complete by May. So he's actually managed to build that factory and do it. And this is something I found in the record office. The record office were very helpful as well, and I've had some interesting papers there. This is a bunch of papers to do with Walters and Warners. And going back to Samuel again, on the 4th of July 1819, he writes, the Braintree mill, and he's talking about Pound End Mill here, has not hitherto fulfilled the expectations. Principal causes of the degree of failure that is indisputable, I clearly trace to circumstances purely external to the throwing business. Now, what's happened is that he and his brother-in-law only used this mill for a short while because he was able to acquire the lease of the mill at Bocking, which had been built by the Savills as a water-powered wool filling factory, and that was much better for driving the machinery. So he has to sell this mill, and he stops production in the Panfield Lane mill as well. So this is the indenture. This is the agreement that the 2 Walters brothers make with this William Walter Slade Amaris of Lisson Street, Paddington. He must have been who Courtauld and Taylor sold Pound End Mill to. And it's wonderful the way it's written. Assigns all that mill or mill house wherein the silk business now is or hath been carried out, situate and being in Braintree in the county of Essex, and lately erected and built by Messrs Courtauld and Taylor. And they agreed a yearly rent of £65, which if you use the Bank of England inflation application, works out to £6,880 now, which doesn't seem a lot to me, but anyway, there we go. And in there also, I found this, and this is a schedule of all the fixtures within that building. And it's the first time I've actually sort of got an idea of quite what was inside Pound End Mill. So you've got a horse wheel with counterweight actions for 4 horses, 2 upright shafts, all sorts of, you can see it all there. A steam boiler, but the steam boiler was obviously just for heating the building, not for actually running machinery or anything like that, because all the machinery was either run by the horses or by men, nearly all the horses though. So that's where Walters, Stephen and Daniel start work from 1822 onwards. In between time, they open another factory, and I didn't know this until I was reading, found some information from the Stephen Walters website, which had been researched by Liz Tranau, who was another Walters family member. And they opened this factory near Kettering. And you can see here, this is the 1826 map, and there's the silk mill. Quite short-lived, but they had power looms operating there quite early on. In 1824, they started that. But anyway, 1825, Stephen and Daniel decide to go their separate ways. Stephen wanted to continue doing dress silks and silks for umbrellas and parasols. Daniel wants to concentrate on furniture silks. So they agree to end the partnership on the 27th of May, and Daniel agrees to pay Stephen £130, which is £13,755 in 2024. So this is the real start of Daniel Walters, the furniture silk people. And this is the tithe map of 1845. And this again was in the record office. I'm just trying to move that out. There we go. And there we are. That's Pound End Mill just there. So at this time, the other side of South Street, as it is now, or Lower Railway Street, there's no factory. There's just cottages. That's all. But they do quite well. And he buys some land on the other side of the road in 1856. And this is a letter heading that we've got in the archive, dated the 28th of October, 1859. And I've cropped it so we can have a better view of it. And there it is. So that's Pound End Mill. This is what we now call South Street. And that's the front range of Warner's Mills as we now know them, or New Mills as it was known then. It's full of artistic license, this image. Robert and I, when we were looking at it last week, we thought, well, is that Pound End Mill with all those windows in it? I'm sure there's not that many, and there aren't, but anyway. So he builds quite a good reputation. So there it is, 1877, and you can see how it's expanded. So there's Pound End Mill again. There's that first range there, and they've built all these other buildings now as well. So it's becoming quite a concern. So he builds a fantastic reputation for silks and velvets for furnishers. And from the 1840s, he concentrates much more on figured fabrics, so damasks, brocatelles, than plain fabrics, plain silks. And there's a Royal Society of Arts exhibition in 1849, and they get mentioned in that as this as a very good manufacturer of these sorts of things. This is another interesting. This is the actual advert from the Cabinet and Upholstery Advertiser from 1877. And look at all the different fabrics they're making and all the different widths they're making. And I just want to go back to that previous one, because it's saying here, look, they're not just manufacturing these silk tabarets, brocatelles, carriage silks. Tabarets are striped fabrics where you've got one stripe is a satin weave and the next stripe is an ordinary tabby weave. But they're also importing fabrics from abroad, French tapestries, Utrecht velvets, French chintzes. They're also, the interesting thing here that I'd never picked up before, why am I sitting here pointing at the screen because you can't see that? Chintz furniture printers. Now, that means that they were printing cottons. I didn't realize they were doing it that early. And we've got no samples, as far as I know, in the archive of anything that early. We've got loads from the Warner days, but not from the Walters days. So I just wanted to point that out to you. So he's doing well. For some reason, they don't exhibit at the Great Exhibition in 1851. But that's a early 20s image of it, and it's very much the same as that earlier letterhead, that advert. So in 1854, there's an article in the Essex County Standard saying that in September that year they employed 200 people there. And as I said before, they bought land in 1856 on the south side of the road. So here we go, Pound End Mill. So we're talking about this land here to start with. The other interesting thing is that in 1861, they open a building outside the parish of Braintree off the Notley Road. And in 1949, Alec Hunter, who was a very important designer at Warner's, he gave a talk to Braintree and District Textile Society about the history of Warner's. And I'm going to read an account that he reproduces in that from the Chelmsford Chronicle of the 9th of August 1861, and it says this: on Monday the work people at Braintree, in the employ of Messrs. Daniel Walters and Sons, furniture silk manufacturers, celebrated the opening of a new factory. The work people assembled at the old factory, whence, headed by a brass band, they walked in procession, bearing a variety of beautiful banners, specimens of their workmanship, through the town to the new building. Here they partook of an excellent dinner, Mr. George Cheeseman in the chair, and after the removal of cloth, the usual loyal toasts having been duly honoured, the chairman gave the health of Messrs. Daniel Walters and Sons, and prosperity to their trade, which was responded to with hearty cheers. Other appropriate toasts followed, the concluding one being the ladies, and the festivities were spiritedly kept up by a ball in the evening. So that's 1861, but in 1869, 1870, the building is re-erected on the new mills site. So it's moved up here to South Street, and the Notley factory, as it was known, was moved from Rifle Hill, from Notley Road to New Mills. And I can remember talking to people who worked at Warner's that even as late as the 1960s, that particular building was still referred to as the Notley shop. After this date, in the early 1860s, Pound End Mill just here was just used to store Jacquard cards. Now, 1862, they're employing over 300 people, but there's competition round the corner. This is a piece in the archive of a narrow hand-woven silk, as I say there, based on Raphael's decorations of the Vatican's loggias. It was part of a V&A exhibition in 1862. Look at the size of the repeat, 85 inches. That's a monster piece of fabric, it really is, but only 21 inches wide, over 2 meter repeat. So it's a big, big design. But it shows you the sorts of things that Walters were making in the 1860s, all woven by hand in that factory. But round the corner, there's Benjamin Warner. Now, he was born in 1828 into a family business. His father built Jacquard loom harnesses. Now, the harnesses are the part of the loom that lifts the threads to create the pattern. But his father died when Benjamin's only 11. So he then starts helping his mother, Anne Warner, and she was very unusual because she took over the management and running of the business, and he was very successful. Now, some time ago in the archive, we found, or someone found, a ledger from Anne Warner, and it's an accounts book. And when I was looking through it, all of a sudden I came across this page, and look at this, Messrs. Courtauld and Co., Braintree Mill, Essex, July 1846, and it's actually signed by Benjamin Warner himself as settled. So I think, although it's generally accepted that they made Jacquard harnesses, I think they also made warps for the weavers as well. So this is what possibly this is, but it's very difficult to be definite about it. So there's another connection there between Walters, Warners, and New Mills in Braintree. And where it talks about this Braintree Mills in Essex, they're talking about the mill on Chapel Hill, which was demolished in the mid-80s. So this is another design we've got in the archive. And it's, again, I just wanted to show you the sorts of things that Walters were able to produce. This is a design, we don't know who it was designed by, but it's hand woven in 1875. It's very similar to a wallpaper design. Now, I'd never heard of William Woolhams and Co. I had to do a little bit of research and discover that they started in 1807 and remained in family hands till they were acquired by Sandersons later in the 19th century. So Warner is in a position to expand his business, and in 1857 he purchases the card cutting and jacquard machine making firm of Alphonse Bernier, and he purchases the stock, equipment, and thousands of designs. Bernier remains with him to only for a month, though, to pass on his knowledge. But by 1861, Warner is employing 33 women and 12 men. And then in 1870 or thereabouts, he collaborates with Charles Sillett and a man called Wager Charles Ram, and they launch Warner, Sillett and Ram in 1870, and that's the start of the whole Warner business. Sillett becomes unwell fairly early on. He retires in 1874, but Ram stays in partnership with Warner for some time, up until the end of the 19th century, really. And Ram's continued as a business up until the early 2000s. I actually worked with them for a while, and they ended up as a company called Ram, Son and Crocker. They were in the end were bought out by a US company, and the name's disappeared completely now. Now, one of Benjamin's early partners was this gentleman, William Folliot. He's born in 1835, and he and Benjamin Warner worked together for about 2 years, starting in about 1867. Now, Folliot also worked for Norris and Company in Spitalfields, who Warner's buy later on in the century. And they had a first-class reputation. They wove damask, brocatelles, poplins, all sorts of furnishing silks. They've been awarded first-class medals in London in 1851 and the Paris exhibition in 1855. Their brocades and brocatelles and damask have all been used extensively in royal palaces and Windsor as well. So shortly after this success with Norris, he decides to go on his own and start up in business. And he starts trading as W. Folliot, designer for fabrics, 457 Bethnal Green Road. And I got this information from an account, a biography written by his great niece, a lady called Elfrida Siddick, who I had the pleasure to meet some years ago. And in the family, they've got quite a lot of Folliot textile samples. He became more and more prolific, and his talent grew. And in 1872, he got in touch with the South Kensington Museum, which is what we now call the V&A, and he offered to contribute some specimens of his work to the branch museum at Bethnal Green. Now, that was what we knew as the Bethnal Green Museum of Childhood, actually, until relatively recently. I can't think what it's called now, but it's still part of the V&A. Now, there is an account that his offer was accepted, and the director of the South Kensington Museum, Mr. G.F. Dunscombe, writes to him saying, "I am directed to inform you that the authorities of the South Kensington Museum have pleasure in accepting your kind offer to contribute a collection of specimens illustrative of the silk manufacture for exhibition at the Branch Museum at Bethnal Green." So he's doing quite well. But then in 1887, he's offered a job by Daniel Walters to come to Braintree, which he does, and he's manager and head designer as well. And things keep going really quite well. That's the photo of him and his wife. At the end of their life, they retired to Quendon near Saffron Walden, and he lived to almost 90, I think, from memory. But they started to install power looms quite early on. Walters engaged an engineer from Lancashire called Bradbury. He incidentally was the father of Joseph Bradbury. Bradbury's had a business at Braintree. They actually operated out of Pound End Mill, and they made hydraulic lifts for car workshops. But anyway, his father, Mr. Bradbury, was an engineer, and he started to develop their own power looms. And they were incredibly innovative. Some of them wove fabrics on power looms up to 63 inches wide, but they've got similar numbers of threads per inch in the warps as hand woven ones. And there is a thought that it was Bradbury's experiments with power looms contributed towards the demise of Daniel Walters and Sons. That, along with the general decline after 1860, when the tax on silk imports was increased. So we're moving on now. We're into the 1880s, 1890s. Before he moved to Quendon, this is where he lived, Mr. Folliot, in the old house on Bradford Street. Doesn't look like that anymore, does it? But anyway, there we go. And there's one of his designs. Beautiful fabric. Designed in 1884, before he came to Braintree. Yeah, fantastic piece of work. And this, I think, is my favourite that we picked out of the archives to look at. This is what would be called a silk tissue, in that it's got two different wefts in it. And if we look at it up close, look at this detail in here to get the shading in the flowers. It's very, 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 very clever. And to think that this was woven on a hand loom, and it's the art of the jacquard designer really at its peak. It really is fantastic. Now, in the archive, we've got some of these, and these are loom weights. And these are two different periods, because the one is DW is before it's formed into Daniel Walters and Sons. And these were hung on the back of the loom to tension the warp. And I've got a lovely picture here. This is a man called Tom Watson in about 1948. And there are the loom weights. So they're connected on there. They're hung on this long metal rod. And they've got ropes round the back of the warp there. This is the warp. The warp runs the length of the fabric. And he's weaving. This must be, again, it's a plain fabric because there's no sign of any jacquard up above. So he's weaving probably a taffeta or something like that. He could be weaving a satin even, for all I know. We can't tell from these pictures, but it gives you a good idea what the interior of New Mills was like, and as late as 1948. But we have got electric light now, so that's that's an improvement. And that's just a close-up of those loom weights, just to show you the sorts of things that went on. But we're starting to see Walters getting into trouble. Now, I was always given the impression that there was Daniel Walters II, his son, and there was Lindsay Walters, who was Daniel Walters the first grandson. Now, when I started digging into it, I discover, in actual fact, Lindsay Walters was Daniel Walters the first son by his second marriage. His first wife died. And it was always said that it was Lindsay Walters who started the rot at the Walters business. Daniel II, so Daniel Walters' eldest son, he dies quite young. And I found in the record office a record of a loan, a mortgage, given to Lindsay and Daniel Howard Walters, who were uncle and nephew, by Lucy Walters, who was the widow of Daniel II. Now, that was a mortgage of £10,900 in June 1871. So one could argue that perhaps they were starting to find financial problems as early as the 1870s. Now, again, if we use the Bank of England inflation index, that £10,900 is equivalent to just over £1 million today. So it's a lot of money for somebody to lend their their brother-in-law. This again from the record office, and it's a declaration where Lindsay Walters and Daniel Walters sell the New Mills site as early as 1886, and they sold it so they could clear the mortgage debt to Lucy. So they're having problems, obviously, but they approach Benjamin Warner in about 1892, 1893 to see if he'd like to buy the business, because they are getting into all sorts of difficulties. There is a story, whether it's an urban myth or not, I don't know, that Lindsay Walters forgot to pay the workers and he was waylaid just outside Braintree on his way back from wherever he'd been because he hadn't paid them. But anyway, Benjamin Warner says, no, I'm not interested. I'm not prepared to pay the price that you're asking for the business. So sadly, in 1894, Walters goes into liquidation, into receivership, and various negotiations then take place after this date between the receivers and mainly Benjamin Warner and his two sons. And this is the agreement that is signed on the 7th of August 1895. And this is a document in the archive. No, sorry, this is a document in the archive that I'm talking about here. This is dated 1894, and it's a valuation of the Walters business. And it goes through virtually mill building by mill building, and it allocates a value for all the machinery and the yards and everything. But the amazing thing is that the total value is £77,653, but £60,000 is the value put on the 3,000 designs, the jacquard cards, which number 9 million, plus everything in the course of manufacture at Braintree, and all the samples and pattern books in circulation amongst the customers in the United Kingdom and elsewhere. That's a tremendous amount of money that was, you know, that for the actual designs themselves. That was what the receivers felt that the value was on. And then this is what I'm talking about. This is the agreement between Walters and the Warners, and this is quite interesting. This is the agreement that they came to buy the business. And the interesting thing is this last condition where it says none of the Walters can trade as silk weavers anywhere in the UK, and it says will not at any time or times hereafter, directly or indirectly, either by themselves or as agent or agents or otherwise, carry on, manage, or be concerned, engaged, or interested in the business of silk weavers in any part of the United Kingdom. So that was quite telling, really. So after that, then it becomes Warner's, and we understand a bit more about what goes on after that date. The first thing Warner's do when they take over the business is they decide that the power looms are not worth doing anything with, so they're taken out and scrapped, and the room where they were has got they put power hand looms into it. A number of the weavers from Walters had already gone to work for Warner's after 1870 when Warner started. And I remember there was an older weaver at Warner's called Bob Mears, and Bob Mears' father actually came out from Bethnal Green. Warner's had a factory in Hollybush Gardens in Bethnal Green, just off the Bethnal Green Road, and he always told the tale that his father walked from Bethnal Green to Braintree. Now, Bob was a great one for stories, so whether that was true or not, I don't know, but he was quite a character. He was the spitting image of Burl Ives, if anybody remembers what Burl Ives was like. But he was the last velvet weaver that they had of any description. Now, when I started digging into the census returns, I found out something quite interesting, and that is the fact that none of the Walters ever lived in Braintree. Now, you see here, 1841, Daniel Walters the first is living at Fallow Corner, Finchley. Now, North Finchley, that's basically where the North Circular Road is now. Now, if you remember, he's got his offices in the city. Now, to get from there into the city, then it wasn't round the corner or anything. And to thought about getting from there out to Braintree must have been, a much more difficult thing to do. Of course, the thing is, this is just one night in a 10-year period. So it could be that they just happened to be in these places when the census was taken. So Daniel the First, he's living in Finchley, then in Stoke Newington. That's a bit closer to Finsbury, to that area of London, Finsbury Square. Then he's living in Holloway, and then he dies in Holloway there in 1876. His son is Daniel II. He's the son of Daniel I and his first wife, Sophia. He's living in Finchley. Then he's living on the premises where their offices are in 1851, and he dies in 1861 before before the next census is taken. Daniel Howard is Daniel II's son. He's living in Shoreditch, obviously, because his parents are living there. And then I can't find him in 1861, but in 1871 he's living in Wanstead. But he does live in Braintree because he dies in 1880 at Bellevue, Coggeshall Road, which was a large house on the corner of Albert Road and Coggeshall Road, sort of opposite where the BP garage is now, more or less, just there. But Lindsay Walters, who I thought was the grandson, is not the grandson. He's the son of Daniel I, and he's the black sheep of the family in some ways, you could say. So he's living in North Finchley in 1841, and again then he's living in Islington. 1871, he's in Brighton on the night of the census. So whether they're on holiday there or not, I don't know. But then again, from 1891, he's in North Finchley, and he ends his life interesting there. 1891, he says his occupation is a retired silk manufacturer. Now, as far as I'm concerned, as far as all the records show, Daniel Walters is still going strong in 1891, but he's saying he's retired. What does that mean? We don't know really. And 1901, he's still living there as well. And then 1911, he's still living in North Finchley. So then we go back to the Warners and what's going on there. So here's Benjamin. He lives to 1908. His son, Sir Frank Warner, he takes over the business and he drives it forward from the 1910s onwards, 1920s onwards. He's the one who's the great innovator. He decides to make three pile velvet by hand, which is the first time it's ever been done, and that's very successful. He drives the company on in up to the 1930s. And then Sir Frank's son-in-law, Sir Ernest Goodale, he takes over the business from then onwards. This is just to give you an idea of the family connections, really, as much as anything else. And then the last one before the business is sold is St. John Tibbets, who's Sir Frank Warner's grandson. His son Jolyon was scheduled to take over, but the business was split up before he could take over. And of course, they start in the latter years, they're much more known in the furnishings world, in the interiors world, for printed fabrics rather than the woven fabrics. The woven fabrics were much more they're thought of for royal palaces and for royal events, weddings and the funerals and things. But it was the print side which was a big side of it. And between them and GP&J Baker, they really cornered the market probably from the 30s onwards in this country. They were who you went to, or Sanderson's. That was the other one, of course. So just to finish up with, I've got a few more images of the site. This is 1952 South Street. So again, there's Pound End Mill just there. This is New Mills here. So you've got the range that still survives today. There's a little cottage next door that I shared back in the early 70s. So I actually lived on site, one of the few people who can say that. So that's that one. And then I zoomed in as well. So there it is. You can see Pound End Mill quite clearly there. These houses were long gone by the time I moved in about 71. And these were gone as well. There's the pub that's still there now. And this house is still there as well. And then that's the image again back from 1877. So you can see there, it's not really changed that much. You've got the chimney, you've got the chimney. You've got Pound End Mill and the front range of buildings there, and there they are still there. And then this next one there, that's a better view really, because you can see it much more clearly. So you've got, again, this is now what is the archive just here. This building survives, that building survives. These were demolished after the factory shut in 1972 because Essex County Council were going to put a ring road right through the middle here. And then it was discovered that it actually was all grade 1 listed, so it was shelved, but they did manage to demolish this central range of buildings here. So there's Pound End Mill there. And then that again, that's the 1920s one. I can't see my note at the bottom here. Early 20s, that's it. So there again, you can see there, it's much the same as it was in those early pictures. So it didn't change that much from about 1870 onwards, really. So 100 years stayed the same, a little bit of extensions here and there, but not a lot. And it's remarkable, really, that this survives and some of the other bits survive as well. So there we go, and that's the end of it.